Have you ever wondered who would win in a battle between history's most legendary warriors? Picture this: a steel-clad European knight thundering across a battlefield on his destrier, lance lowered for the charge. Now imagine a masterful Japanese samurai, katana gleaming in the sunlight, moving with the fluid precision of decades of training. Two warrior cultures, separated by thousands of miles and completely different philosophies of combat, yet both representing the absolute pinnacle of medieval warfare in their respective worlds. Today we're diving deep into one of history's most fascinating debates: knights versus samurai. Who were truly the ultimate warriors? But here's what most people don't realize about this comparison. This isn't just about who had the sharper sword or the stronger armor. This is a clash between two entirely different ways of thinking about honor, combat, and what it means to be a warrior. By the end of this deep dive, you'll understand not just how these legendary fighters would match up against each other, but why their very different approaches to warfare shaped the destinies of entire civilizations. And trust me, what I discovered while researching this comparison completely changed how I think about medieval combat. We're going to explore their training methods, their weapons, their codes of honor, and yes, we'll settle the ultimate question of who would actually win in a fight. But first, let me paint you a picture of just how different these two warrior classes really were. The year is 1180. In the rolling hills of England, a young noble boy begins his journey toward knighthood. He's barely 10 years old, sent away from his family to serve as a page in another lord's household. His days are filled with learning courtly manners, basic weapon handling, and the intricate social codes that govern noble society. Meanwhile, halfway around the world in feudal Japan, another young warrior in training kneels in meditation before dawn, his mind focused not just on the physical techniques of swordsmanship, but on achieving the mental discipline that will make him one with his blade. These weren't just soldiers. These were the products of two completely different approaches to creating the perfect warrior. The European knight emerged from the chaos following the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, when local strongmen needed heavily armored cavalry to maintain order and defend their territories. The Japanese samurai evolved during the Heian period as mounted archers serving powerful aristocratic families, eventually becoming the backbone of Japan's military and political structure under the shogunate system. But here's where it gets really interesting. Both warrior classes developed around the same time period, roughly between the 9th and 12th centuries, yet they created completely different solutions to the same fundamental problem. How do you create a warrior class that's not just effective in battle, but also stable enough to govern society? The knights solved this through the feudal system and the code of chivalry. Land was granted in exchange for military service, creating a web of obligations and loyalties that theoretically kept the warrior class in check. The samurai developed Bushido, the way of the warrior, which emphasized absolute loyalty to one's lord and a willingness to die rather than face dishonor. Now, you might think these codes were similar, but the differences reveal everything about how these warriors thought about combat and honor. A European knight could serve multiple lords if he held land from different sources, creating complex webs of competing loyalties. But a samurai served one lord, and one lord only. This wasn't just a political difference, it was a fundamental philosophical divide about the nature of loyalty itself. Let's talk about how these warriors actually trained, because this is where you really start to see the profound differences in their approaches to combat. The path to becoming a knight was a long apprenticeship system. That 10-year-old page I mentioned, he'd spend years learning basic etiquette and weapon handling before becoming a squire at age 14. As a squire, he'd serve directly under a knight, learning the brutal reality of medieval combat through hands-on experience. Knight training was intensely physical. They'd lift heavy stones and logs to build the grip strength needed to wield massive swords while wearing 60 pounds of plate armor. Wrestling was a crucial part of their education, not just for the physical conditioning, but because it taught them how to fight if they were knocked from their horse. The whole system was designed to create warriors who could deliver devastating charges with heavy lances, then transition to brutal close-quarters combat with swords, maces, and warhammers. But samurai training was something else entirely. Yes, they learned the physical techniques of combat, mastering the katana, the Yumi longbow, and horseback riding. But their education went far beyond mere martial skills. They studied calligraphy, poetry, and Confucian ethics. They practiced meditation and absorbed the principles of Zen Buddhism, which taught them to act without thinking, to become one with their weapons in a way that transcended mere technique. This Zen influence created something unique in military history. Samurai were trained to fight with what they called no mind, a state where conscious thought didn't interfere with instinctive action. While a knight might logically plan his attacks and defensive moves, a properly trained samurai moved without that analytical process, gaining precious milliseconds in combat that could mean the difference between life and death. The weapons these warriors carried tell their own story about their different approaches to combat. Knights were armed for devastating frontal assaults. Their primary weapon was the lance, sometimes reaching 10 feet in length, designed to concentrate the full momentum of a charging warhorse into a single devastating point. When the lance shattered on impact, which it often did, they'd draw their longswords, double-edged blades, capable of both cutting and thrusting, perfect for the brutal melee that followed a cavalry charge. Knights also carried maces and warhammers, weapons specifically designed to crush through armor when swords couldn't penetrate. Their approach to combat was straightforward: use superior armor and weapons to overpower the enemy through sheer force and endurance. Samurai weapons revealed a completely different philosophy. The katana, that legendary curved sword, was designed for lightning-fast draw cuts, allowing a warrior to unsheath and strike in a single fluid motion. But before the katana became their symbol, samurai were primarily archers. The yumi, an asymmetrical longbow over 7 feet long, was their weapon of choice for centuries. This wasn't just about practicality, it was about status. Archery required years of training to master and was considered the most noble form of combat. What's fascinating is how adaptable samurai weapons were compared to knight weapons. While European knights remained wedded to the heavy cavalry charge for centuries, samurai constantly evolved their tactics and weapons. When firearms arrived in Japan, samurai didn't resist the technology like many European knights did. They embraced it, integrating matchlock rifles into their combat doctrine with devastating effectiveness at battles like Nagashino in 1575. The armor these warriors wore reveals even more about their different approaches to survival on the battlefield. Knight armor evolved from simple chainmail to the incredible full-plate suits of the late medieval period. By the 15th century, a fully armored knight was essentially invulnerable to most weapons of the time. These suits of plate armor were masterpieces of metallurgy, providing complete protection while still allowing surprising mobility through ingenious articulation of the joints. But this protection came at a cost. Full plate armor was incredibly expensive, meaning only the wealthiest nobles could afford it. It was also heavy, requiring tremendous physical conditioning to wear effectively in combat. And while it provided excellent protection against medieval weapons, it became increasingly vulnerable as firearms developed. Samurai armor took a completely different approach. Made from small lacquered plates laced together with silk cords, it prioritized mobility over absolute protection. The design reflected the samurai's origins as mounted archers who needed to move freely to draw their longbows effectively. Later, as samurai evolved into close combat warriors, their armor adapted while maintaining that emphasis on speed and agility. This fundamental difference in armor philosophy reveals something crucial about how these warriors thought about combat. Knights believed in creating an impregnable defense and using superior protection to outlast their enemies. Samurai believed in avoiding attacks entirely through superior speed and technique, only blocking what they couldn't dodge. The training methods and weapon choices of knights and samurai created two completely different types of warriors, each perfectly adapted to their environment and enemies. But which approach was actually more effective? That's where our story gets really interesting, because history gave us some remarkable examples of both warrior classes in action. The real test of any warrior class isn't in their training halls or ceremonial displays, but in the crucible of actual battle. And here's where the stories of knights and samurai become absolutely fascinating, because we can trace the rise and fall of both through some of history's most legendary conflicts. Let me take you to the muddy fields of Agincourt in 1415, where the flower of French chivalry faced off against a ragged English army. The French had everything going for them, at least on paper. They outnumbered the English by at least 3-1, possibly more. Their knights were the finest heavy cavalry in Europe, mounted on powerful war horses and encased in state-of-the-art plate armor that made them nearly invincible in close combat. But Henry V had learned the lessons that were reshaping medieval warfare. He positioned his army carefully, with deadly English longbowmen protected behind sharpened stakes. When the French cavalry charged across that waterlogged field, something extraordinary happened. The cream of European knighthood, warriors who had trained their entire lives for exactly this moment, were cut down by common archers firing from fixed positions. The arrows didn't just kill, they created chaos. Horses went down screaming, throwing their armored riders into the mud. Knights who survived the initial volleys found themselves trapped, unable to rise under the weight of their own armor, defenseless against English soldiers with mallets and daggers who moved between the fallen like grim reapers. In a single afternoon, the tactical dominance that knights had enjoyed for centuries began to crumble. But here's what makes this even more significant. The Battle of Agincourt wasn't an anomaly, it was part of a pattern. At Crécy in 1346, at Poitiers in 1356, again and again, the traditional knightly charge was being defeated by disciplined infantry and missile troops. The very armor that made knights so formidable in close combat became a death trap when they couldn't close with their enemies. Now let's travel to the other side of the world, to feudal Japan, where samurai were facing their own evolution in warfare. Unlike European knights, who often resisted change, samurai demonstrated remarkable adaptability. When Portuguese traders introduced firearms to Japan in 1543, the samurai didn't see these weapons as dishonorable or beneath them. They saw opportunity. The Battle of Nagashino in 1575 showcases this adaptability perfectly. Oda Nobunaga faced the fearsome cavalry of the Takeda clan, warriors whose mounted charges had dominated Japanese battlefields for generations. But instead of meeting cavalry with cavalry in the traditional manner, Nobunaga deployed thousands of Ashigaru foot soldiers armed with matchlock rifles behind wooden palisades. The result was devastating. Wave after wave of Takeda cavalry crashed against those defensive positions, their riders cut down by coordinated volleys of gunfire. The samurai leading these charges weren't cowards. They died heroically, following their code of Bushido to the very end. But courage couldn't overcome tactical innovation and superior firepower. What's remarkable is how different the samurai response was compared to European knights. Rather than viewing firearms as unchivalrous, many samurai embraced them as just another tool of warfare. They integrated guns into their combat doctrine while maintaining their traditional values of honor and loyalty. This flexibility helped Japanese warfare evolve rapidly, creating hybrid fighting forces that combined the mobility of traditional samurai with the firepower of early modern armies. But perhaps no battle illustrates the ultimate fate of both warrior classes better than the Battle of Shiroyama in 1877. This wasn't medieval combat. This was the final death throes of the samurai way of life. Saigo Takamori, one of the last great samurai leaders, made his final stand on a hill overlooking Kagoshima with just 500 followers. Facing them was the modern Imperial Japanese army, 30,000 strong, equipped with artillery, Gatling guns, and modern rifles. The contrast couldn't have been starker. On one side, warriors armed primarily with swords and traditional weapons, following a code of honor that demanded death before dishonor. On the other, a professional army using the latest military technology and tactics. The battle lasted less than a day. Artillery bombardments shattered the samurai defenses before the infantry assault even began. When Saigo's men launched their final desperate charges, they were mowed down by machine gun fire. It was the end of an era, the moment when the age of the individual warrior hero finally gave way to modern industrial warfare. But here's what's truly fascinating about these historical examples. They don't just tell us about the decline of knights and samurai, they reveal something profound about the nature of military evolution itself. Both warrior classes fell victim to the same forces: technological advancement, changing tactics, and the rise of professional armies that prioritized effectiveness over individual heroism. Knights couldn't adapt quickly enough to the rise of missile weapons and disciplined infantry. Their entire tactical doctrine was built around the devastating cavalry charge, and when that charge could be stopped by stakes and arrows, they struggled to find a new role on the battlefield. Some tried to adapt, fighting on foot or adopting new weapons, but the fundamental problem remained. The economic and social system that supported knighthood was breaking down. Samurai, by contrast, showed greater flexibility. They adopted new weapons and tactics while trying to preserve their cultural identity. But ultimately, they too were swept away by modernization. The Meiji Restoration didn't just change Japan's government, it transformed the entire basis of military power from individual warrior skill to industrial capacity and modern organization. So what does all this tell us about our original question? Who were history's ultimate warriors? The answer isn't as simple as you might think. In terms of individual combat skill, both knights and samurai represented the absolute pinnacle of their respective military traditions. A fully armored knight was virtually unstoppable in close combat, while a master samurai possessed speed, technique, and mental discipline that bordered on the supernatural. But the real measure of a warrior class isn't just individual prowess, it's adaptability. And here, the historical record is clear. Samurai showed greater flexibility in adapting to changing warfare, while knights remained more wedded to traditional tactics, even as those tactics became obsolete. Yet both faced the same ultimate fate. The age of the individual warrior hero ended not because these men lacked courage or skill, but because warfare itself was changing. The rise of gunpowder, professional armies, and industrial capacity meant that individual prowess mattered less than organization, logistics, and technology. This brings us to the ultimate hypothetical question that historians and martial arts enthusiasts have debated for decades. In a one-on-one encounter between a knight and a samurai, both at the peak of their respective fighting abilities, who would actually win? The answer to that ultimate question depends entirely on the circumstances of their encounter, and the variables are more complex than most people realize. Let's break this down systematically, because the devil is truly in the details. In open terrain, mounted combat, the knight holds a decisive advantage. Picture this scenario. Both warriors approach each other across a wide field, the knight thundering forward on his destrier with a 12-foot lance couched under his arm. The samurai, equally skilled on horseback, draws his Yumi longbow and attempts to loose arrows at the charging knight. Here's where physics becomes brutal. That knight, weighing perhaps 200 pounds, plus 60 pounds of plate armor, mounted on a 1,500-pound warhorse moving at 30 miles per hour, represents roughly 4 tons of kinetic energy focused into the steel tip of his lance. Even if the samurai's arrows find their mark, they're unlikely to penetrate quality plate armor at range. And if that lance connects, the impact would be absolutely devastating, potentially lifting the samurai clean from his saddle. But change the scenario to a forest clearing or narrow mountain pass, and suddenly the dynamics shift dramatically. The knight's massive warhorse becomes a liability in tight spaces, while the samurai's superior agility and lighter armor allow for rapid movement and repositioning. Here, the samurai's training in fighting on foot gives him options the knight lacks. In dismounted combat, the variables multiply exponentially. The knight's plate armor provides incredible protection, but it also weighs him down and restricts his movement. A master samurai, trained in the art of finding gaps in armor, might slip a tanto dagger between plates or target the vulnerable points at joints and visor slits. But landing such precise strikes against a trained knight who's actively defending himself would require extraordinary skill and more than a little luck. The weapons each warrior carries create their own tactical puzzles. The knight's longsword, with its double-edged blade and crossguard, excels at both cutting and thrusting. Its length gives him reach advantage over the samurai's katana, and its robust construction can withstand the impact of armored combat. The European fighting manuals of the period describe techniques for half-swording, gripping the blade with one hand to deliver precise thrusts against armored opponents. The katana, meanwhile, represents a completely different philosophy of blade work. Its curved single edge and differential hardening create a weapon capable of cuts that can sever limbs in a single stroke. But against plate armor, even the legendary sharpness of Japanese steel would struggle to find purchase. The samurai's advantage lies not in brute force but in speed and precision, using footwork and timing to create openings that brute strength cannot. Mental preparation becomes another crucial factor that's often overlooked in these discussions. The knight approaches combat with the mindset of a heavy shock trooper, trained to overwhelm opponents through superior equipment and decisive charges. His psychological conditioning emphasizes endurance and the ability to continue fighting even when wounded or exhausted. The samurai's mental discipline, forged through Zen meditation and years of spiritual training, operates on entirely different principles. That state of no mind I mentioned earlier isn't just philosophical poetry, it's a practical combat advantage. When a samurai achieves this mental state, his reactions become instantaneous, bypassing the delay that conscious thought creates between perception and action. But here's what makes this hypothetical encounter even more fascinating. Both warriors were products of their specific environments and enemies. Knights developed their tactics fighting other heavily armored cavalry and disciplined infantry formations. Their techniques emphasized breaking through shield walls and engaging in sustained melee combat. Samurai evolved fighting opponents who valued speed and mobility over heavy armor. Japanese warfare emphasized individual duels and lightning-fast engagements where a single mistake could prove fatal. This created warriors who were arguably more technically skilled in one-on-one combat, but perhaps less prepared for the grinding attrition that characterized European battlefields. The seasonal timing of their encounter could even play a role. Knights trained extensively in all weather conditions, their heavy armor providing protection, but also creating heat exhaustion risks in warm weather. Samurai, with their lighter, more breathable armor, might hold advantages in summer conditions while being more vulnerable to the elements in winter campaigns. Weapon maintenance and quality introduce another variable that's often ignored. A knight's sword, while robust, was typically made from European steel, using techniques that prioritized durability over edge retention. A samurai's katana, forged using the legendary Japanese folding techniques, achieved superior hardness and sharpness, but might be more brittle under the stress of armored combat. The truth is, both warrior traditions produced individuals capable of extraordinary feats of arms. Medieval chronicles record knights cleaving through multiple opponents in single combats, their strength and armor making them nearly unstoppable forces on the battlefield. Similarly, Japanese historical accounts describe samurai achieving almost superhuman feats of speed and precision, cutting down enemies before they could react. But perhaps the most honest answer to our hypothetical duel is this: the outcome would depend less on which warrior tradition was superior and more on the specific individuals involved. A master swordsman from either culture, fighting at the peak of his abilities, could potentially defeat his counterpart through skill, luck, or tactical advantage. What we can say with certainty is that both the knight and samurai represented the absolute pinnacle of medieval martial achievement in their respective spheres. Each was perfectly adapted to the challenges of their environment, the enemies they faced, and the technology available to them. The knight's approach to combat, emphasizing superior equipment and overwhelming force, dominated European warfare for centuries precisely because it was so effective against the threats knights actually faced. Similarly, the samurai's emphasis on speed, technique, and mental discipline created warriors perfectly suited to the fluid, individual-focused combat that characterized Japanese warfare. This brings us to a deeper question about the nature of martial excellence itself. Is the ultimate warrior the one with the best equipment, the most advanced training, or the strongest mental discipline? History suggests that true martial superiority comes from the ability to adapt these elements to specific circumstances. The most successful knights were those who could adjust their tactics to different enemies and battlefield conditions. The greatest samurai were those who could maintain their technical precision while adapting to new weapons and changing military doctrine. In both cases, flexibility and intelligence mattered as much as physical prowess. Modern martial artists who study both European and Japanese fighting systems often find that each tradition offers unique insights into combat effectiveness. Western martial arts emphasize leverage, timing, and the efficient use of armor and weapons in close combat. Eastern martial arts focus on body mechanics, mental state, and the seamless integration of mind and weapon. The ultimate lesson from comparing knights and samurai isn't that one was superior to the other, but that different approaches to warfare can achieve equal levels of effectiveness through completely different means. Both warrior classes faced the same fundamental challenge: how to survive and triumph in lethal combat against skilled opponents. Their solutions were radically different, yet both proved devastatingly effective within their proper context. As we've seen through their historical examples, both knights and samurai eventually faced the same fate: obsolescence in the face of changing military technology and tactics. But their legacies endured long after their battlefield dominance ended, influencing everything from literature and philosophy to modern military doctrine and martial arts. The knight's emphasis on heavy armor and decisive shock action evolved into modern armored warfare, while the samurai's integration of mental discipline with physical technique influenced military training programs worldwide. Both warrior traditions contributed essential elements to our understanding of what it means to be a warrior in the truest sense of the word. So here we stand at the end of our journey through two of history's most legendary warrior traditions, and the answer to our original question reveals something far more profound than a simple winner and loser. Both knights and samurai achieved something extraordinary. They created martial traditions so perfect for their time and place that they dominated their respective worlds for centuries. The knight, with his thundering charge and impenetrable armor, embodied the raw power and technological supremacy that defined medieval European warfare. The samurai, with his lightning reflexes and spiritual discipline, represented the perfect fusion of mind, body, and blade that characterized the warrior ideal of feudal Japan. Each was the ultimate expression of their culture's approach to combat, honor, and what it meant to dedicate one's life to the way of war. But perhaps the most important lesson from comparing these legendary warriors isn't about who would win in a hypothetical duel. It's about recognizing that true greatness in warfare, as in life, comes from perfect adaptation to your environment and unwavering commitment to excellence. Both knights and samurai understood that being a warrior meant more than just fighting. It meant embodying ideals that would outlast any single battle or even any single lifetime. Today, centuries after the last knight charged across a European battlefield, and decades after the final samurai drew his sword in anger, their influence continues to shape how we think about honor, duty, and the warrior spirit. That, more than any individual combat prowess, makes them both truly ultimate warriors in their own right.